August 1944. France was collapsing faster than any Allied planner had predicted. The German front wasn't retreating so much as dissolving. Roads were clogged with abandoned equipment. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. And at the center of it all, George S. Patton's Third Army was moving with terrifying speed, sometimes advancing faster than its own supply lines could keep up. Patton loved momentum. He believed speed killed the enemy faster than bullets. Every mile gained without pause broke German morale further. Every hesitation gave the enemy time to regroup. To Patton, hesitation was not neutral. It was lethal. That's why the reports that began crossing his desk in mid-August stopped him cold. They weren't reports of enemy resistance. They weren't about fuel shortages or bridge demolitions. They were about his own officers. A company commander who refused to leave a cellar while his platoons assaulted a fortified village. A battalion officer who insisted on coordinating from the rear while junior lieutenants led men through machine gun fire. A senior officer who went silent under artillery bombardment, frozen, unreachable, while chaos unfolded around him. These weren't rumors. These were corroborated accounts, multiple witnesses, NCO statements, after-action reports that all pointed to the same conclusion. The officers hadn't just failed. They had disappeared when leadership mattered most. Under wartime military law, Patton had absolute authority. Cowardice in the face of the enemy was a capital offense. Officers could be court-martialed, stripped of rank, imprisoned, even executed. Patton knew that. Everyone on his staff knew that. But he didn't reach for a firing squad. He didn't even reach for a courtroom. Instead, officers began vanishing. One day they commanded men in combat. The next day they were gone, quietly reassigned, removed from the line, replaced without announcement. No press releases, no charges, no trials, just absence. And in the American Army, absence spoke louder than gunfire. To understand why this was so devastating, you have to understand what it meant to be a combat officer in 1944. These men didn't see themselves as administrators or managers. Their identity wasn't their rank insignia or their paperwork. Their identity was command, leading men forward, standing up when everyone else wanted to go to ground, making decisions while shells were landing and people were screaming for orders. An officer existed for one purpose: to lead under fire. And when Patton removed that purpose, he didn't just end a job. He erased a man's entire professional existence. Patton had seen fear before. He wasn't naive about it. He knew combat broke people. He had seen seasoned soldiers collapse under pressure, had watched confident men unravel after days of shelling and sleeplessness. But fear alone wasn't the issue. Failure was. In Patton's mind, a soldier freezing was tragic. An officer freezing was catastrophic. Because when an officer fails, the consequences multiply. Confusion spreads. Initiative dies. Men hesitate. And hesitation on a battlefield gets people killed. Patton had no patience for that. But he also understood something deeper, something most commanders never fully grasped. Public punishment of officers carried consequences far beyond the individual. A court-martial didn't just judge one man. It called the entire officer corps into question. If captains and majors were being dragged into court for cowardice, what did that say about training, about selection, about leadership itself? Worse, it created doubt. Enlisted men might begin wondering whether their leaders were chosen wisely. Officers might hesitate, not because of fear of the enemy, but fear of legal consequences. Command decisions would slow. Initiative would be strangled by self-preservation. Patton didn't want cautious officers. He wanted aggressive ones. So he built a system that punished failure without paralyzing the army. When reports came in, Patton demanded confirmation. Not gossip, not hearsay, facts. He had staff officers interview NCOs, men Patton trusted far more than polished reports. He compared accounts. He reconstructed moments under fire. If an officer had genuinely failed to lead, the response was immediate. No hearing, no paperwork trail, a summons to headquarters. The conversation was short. You are relieved of combat command. Effective immediately. No argument changed the outcome. No explanation softened the judgment. The decision was final before the officer ever entered the room. And then came the part Patton understood better than anyone. Everyone would know. Not through official channels. Not through orders pinned to bulletin boards. Through the fastest system in any army, the rumor network. Within hours, officers would whisper. By the next day, NCOs would know. Soon, entire divisions understood what had happened. So-and-so froze under fire. Patton pulled him. He's in the rear now. That was all it took. In combat units, reputation is currency. Once it's spent, it never comes back. These officers weren't jailed. They weren't disgraced publicly. They weren't stripped of rank. They were something worse. They were irrelevant. Assigned to supply depots, administrative sections, logistics desks far from the sound of guns. Alive, paid, technically intact, but removed from the only place that mattered. They ate meals while others fought, read reports about battles they should have led, watched peers earn medals and promotions while they filed paperwork. And everywhere they went, people knew. This wasn't punishment meant to reform. It was exile. Patton understood something brutal about leadership culture. For a combat officer, being alive without command was worse than death. Execution ended shame. This made shame permanent. Years later, one officer would write that he replayed the moment he froze every night for the rest of his life. That being alive to remember it, to see others succeed where he failed, was the heaviest sentence imaginable. Patton never apologized for this system. In his mind, war was not a place for therapy or second chances. It was a place where decisions had immediate consequences, measured in blood. And any officer who could not function under fire had already answered the only question that mattered. Could you lead when everything fell apart? If the answer was no, Patton didn't need a courtroom to tell him what to do next. He simply erased you from the fight. And the Third Army kept moving. If you think this story is intense now, it gets even darker when we look at how Patton justified this approach, and what it reveals about the brutal logic of command in total war. Patton was not avoiding courts-martial because he was soft. That misunderstanding comes from people who never studied how he actually thought about war. He had no moral objection to executing officers. He had no sentimental attachment to rank or pedigree. If he believed killing someone would win battles faster, he would not have hesitated. The reason he refused the courtroom was far colder than mercy. Courts-martial were slow. War in August 1944 was moving at a pace the American Army had never experienced. Units were advancing dozens of miles in days. Orders were outdated by the time they were typed. Commanders were improvising hour by hour. Patton did not have weeks to argue about legal definitions of cowardice while his army was crossing rivers and collapsing German fronts. A single failed officer left in place for even one more day could cost hundreds of lives. Patton understood this from experience. In North Africa and Sicily, he had watched hesitation spread like disease. One stalled unit slowed the next. One uncertain officer infected an entire battalion. Momentum died quickly and was nearly impossible to restart. A courtroom could not keep up with a moving front. But speed was only part of the calculation. Public trials were dangerous. The American Army in 1944 depended on belief. Belief that leadership was competent, that officers were worthy of trust, that command decisions were made by men who could handle pressure. A public court-martial for cowardice shattered that belief. It told every soldier in uniform that even officers might break. It told every officer that failure could become a spectacle. Patton knew how morale actually worked in combat units. Soldiers could accept losses. They could accept exhaustion. They could even accept terrible odds. What they could not accept was doubt in leadership. Once doubt crept in, discipline followed it. That was why Patton never announced removals. He never issued public condemnations. He allowed the information to spread quietly, organically, in a way that reinforced fear without undermining faith in the system itself. Everyone knew Patton removed failures, but no one saw the army tearing itself apart over it. There was another reason Patton avoided courts-martial, and it was deeply uncomfortable for the institution itself. If too many officers were formally charged with cowardice, the question would stop being about individual failure. It would become institutional. Who trained these men? Who promoted them? Who selected them for command? The army was expanding at a historic rate. Thousands of officers had been commissioned quickly. Some were brilliant, some were average. Some should never have led men into combat at all. Public trials would expose that reality. Patton didn't want Washington asking questions. He didn't want Congress demanding investigations. He didn't want newspapers examining officer training programs while his army was still fighting. Quiet removal solved all of that. The officer disappeared. The unit moved on. The war continued. From a purely operational standpoint, it was perfect. But the most important reason Patton rejected the courtroom was psychological. Courts-martial turned failure into something negotiable. They created arguments, context, mitigating factors, legal gray areas. Patton hated gray areas. He believed combat leadership was binary. You either functioned under fire or you didn't. If you froze once, the conditions that caused it would happen again. Fear didn't vanish because of testimony or explanation. Patton had seen this pattern repeatedly. Officers who hesitated once hesitated again. Men who froze under artillery froze under tanks. Those who hid once hid again. War exposed character brutally and permanently. In Patton's mind, a trial asked the wrong question. The question was not, were you legally guilty? The question was, can I trust you to lead men forward tomorrow? If the answer was no, everything else was irrelevant. This philosophy horrified lawyers and comforted soldiers. It also terrified officers, because Patton's system removed the illusion of safety. There was no procedural shield, no appeal, no slow-motion collapse of authority where a man could hide behind regulations. You either performed or you vanished, and everyone knew it. Officers began policing themselves harder than any court ever could. Weak leaders resigned quietly. Battalion commanders watched their subordinates closely. NCOs reported failures without hesitation, knowing Patton listened to them. Fear didn't paralyze initiative, it sharpened it. Every officer in the Third Army understood that command was not guaranteed by rank. It was earned daily, under fire, and could be taken away instantly. That understanding created something Patton valued above all else: relentless aggression. Officers pushed forward even when exhausted. They exposed themselves to danger because being seen leading mattered. They made decisions quickly, decisively, because hesitation was more dangerous than being wrong. Patton wasn't creating cowards through fear. He was burning them out of the system. But this efficiency came at a cost. Behind headquarters desks, in supply depots and administrative offices, sat men who once believed they were warriors, men who had worn command like a second skin, men who now lived with a single moment replaying endlessly in their minds. The moment they froze. They were alive. They were fed. They were paid. And they were finished. Some begged for second chances, transfers, opportunities to redeem themselves in other units. Patton almost always refused. A failure under his command stayed marked. You didn't reset reputation by changing uniforms. Late in the war, manpower shortages forced exceptions. A few officers returned to combat roles. None ever escaped the shadow of having been relieved by Patton. And that shadow mattered. Because in the culture of the American Army, nothing was more permanent than the judgment of a commander who never forgot. Patton believed this harsh system saved lives, that every officer he removed prevented future casualties, that the pain of a few was outweighed by the survival of many. Whether he was right, depends on what you believe leadership owes its people: protection from injustice or protection from failure. In the final chapter, we'll confront the moral cost of Patton's method and why, for the men who lived through it, survival did not always mean victory. When the guns finally went quiet and the Third Army slowed its advance, the men Patton had removed did not simply disappear into history. They remained alive, breathing, functioning, carrying something far heavier than wounds or medals. They carried judgment. Unlike those killed in action, they had time to think, time to replay the moments when everything went wrong, time to imagine alternate decisions, braver movements, one step forward instead of one step back. For many of them, the war never really ended. Patton understood this outcome when he made his decisions. He was not blind to the human cost. He simply believed that war did not permit him the luxury of prioritizing individual redemption over collective survival. From Patton's perspective, leadership was not a right. It was a test administered daily under lethal conditions. Passing it once did not guarantee passing it again, and failing it once was enough to remove you permanently. This belief clashed violently with ideas of fairness and due process. In peacetime armies, procedure exists to protect individuals from arbitrary authority. In Patton's army, procedure existed only insofar as it supported victory. Officers who were relieved argued later that they were denied justice. That stress, exhaustion, and fear distorted their actions in moments that lasted seconds but destroyed careers. That they were judged by hearsay rather than formal evidence. Some were right. Combat stress was real. Today, many of these men would likely be diagnosed with conditions that didn't even have names in 1944. Panic, dissociation, trauma responses. These were invisible injuries, and Patton had no patience for them. But Patton's counter-argument was brutally simple. Soldiers did not have the option to freeze. Men in foxholes depended on leadership, whether or not fear was justified. An officer's inner struggle did not stop bullets. A moment of paralysis could doom an entire unit. From Patton's point of view, sympathy did not negate consequence. He once told his staff that a commander's duty was not to be kind, but to win. Kindness could come later. Victory could not. The ethical tension here is unavoidable. Patton's system denied officers a chance to explain themselves. It allowed no formal appeal. It placed enormous power in the hands of one man and trusted his judgment implicitly. That kind of authority is terrifying, and yet the results were undeniable. The Third Army maintained momentum across France at a pace unmatched by any Allied force. Units adapted quickly. Leadership gaps were filled immediately. Junior officers who could function under fire were promoted fast, sometimes overnight. Incompetence did not linger. Fear of removal created a culture where initiative thrived. Officers exposed themselves to danger not for glory, but because visibility mattered. Men followed leaders they could see, leaders who stood when shells fell, leaders who moved forward because stopping was not an option. Patton's army did not break. Whether that was because of his system or in spite of it is a debate that has never ended. What is clear is that his approach reshaped how officers understood command. Leadership became something fragile, conditional, constantly tested. Rank offered no protection. Reputation had to be earned again every day. For the men who failed, the punishment was uniquely cruel. They were not given the clarity of condemnation. There was no verdict, no sentence, no endpoint. Just a quiet reassignment and the knowledge that everyone knew why. They watched from the sidelines as others fought, advanced, and were remembered. Some eventually returned to combat in the final months of the war, when manpower shortages forced the Army's hand. Even then, they carried a mark that could not be erased. They were officers who had once been found wanting. One of them wrote years later that surviving the war felt hollow. He had lived, but not as the man he believed himself to be. He had not died in battle. but something essential had been lost all the same. Patton would not have been moved by this reflection. In his view, war was not about preserving identities. It was about preserving momentum. The living mattered more than the broken, and the mission mattered more than the individual. He once said that a good plan violently executed now was better than a perfect plan executed next week. The same philosophy governed his treatment of officers. Immediate action was better than procedural perfection. Was it fair? That depends on whether fairness is owed to those who fail under pressure or to those who depend on them. Patton chose the latter every time. He spared these officers execution. He spared the Army scandal. He spared the war effort delay. What he did not spare was pride. He gave them life, but stripped it of the one thing they valued most, the right to lead. For a combat officer, that was not mercy. It was a sentence that lasted forever. If this story changed how you see leadership under pressure, make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into history's most ruthless command decisions. And let me know in the comments, was Patton right, or did victory come at too high a human cost?